Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Many of the wars of the developing world seem to have no end in sight. Decade after decade, generation upon generation, they follow a destructive path to the breakdown of social order and national cohesion. What accounts for this relentless conflict? Increasingly, those who study these wars see them as a complex interworking of causes and forces, a fateful tapestry of grievance, belief, and avarice. This intricate view of war may hold within it perception vital to the search for sustainable peace in long, troubled regions. My guest is Cynthia Arnson, co-editor with William Zartman of Rethinking the Economics of War, the Intersection of Need, Creed, and Greed. Cynthia Arnson, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George.
And thank you for this extremely informative and quite colorfully subtitled book, which we're about to discuss. I love that subtitle, Need, Creed, and Greed, Cindy. And let's focus on that title and why you actually put this book together, you and Bill Zartman. For the benefit of our viewers, let me say, in my mind, this is a book that focuses on the long-running conflicts in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, but from a very interesting perspective, one that takes the factors of grievances, ideology, and even avarice and tries to tell us how these interact over time. I guess the first question is obvious, Cindy. Why this approach and why this book? Is this an attempt to sort of deal with these realities in the post-Cold War world, or what brought you to this?
Sure. Well, I think that after the end of the Cold War, there was an expectation as well as a hope by many people that wars that had had an interposition of superpower conflict would come to an end. And I think the decade of the 1990s showed just the opposite, that conflicts, certain conflicts that had been deeply informed by the Cold War, conflicts in Central America, some of them in Africa, including Mozambique, also the Cambodian conflict, came to an end when the superpower element of competition was removed. But there were also numerous examples in which the fighting intensified and ethnic wars became more violent and destructive, both in terms of human life and national territory and treasure. And there was a special focus on the conflicts in Africa, places like Sierra Leone, like Liberia, like Angola, where all of a sudden the resource dimension seemed to be playing a critical role in fueling ever higher levels of violence. And let me explain for a minute what I mean by that. There were natural resources such as diamonds, such as petroleum, oil, that seemed to provide enormous amounts of income to the warring parties, both insurgent groups and national governments. And this was fueling ever higher levels of violence and actually taking these conflicts into a new phase. Right. And so there was an attention of a number of scholars that had been studying African conflicts to look particularly at this economic dimension. And then there was really pioneering work that was done by World Bank economists that tried to correlate the risk of violent conflict with certain kinds of profiles in developing countries. And one of the factors that they found correlated most strongly with civil war was the presence of natural resource income.
Right. Well, that's very well said, Cindy. In fact, as a reader, I mean, I was struck by this economic dimension to these conflicts and how it changed over time in each of the conflicts, and how, and to put it in a shorthand sense, in many instances, the resources were not simply the means to conflict as they traditionally have been, but became ends in themselves, the control of them in many of these cases.
Exactly, and I think that that's what's new and different about these kinds of conflicts and the role that resources have come to play. It's certainly true that rebellions or wars need resources, need economic resources, but the way people have generally conceived of the role of resources has to do with they're financing or being a means to an end, and that end was defined in political terms or in ideological terms. And I think what has happened as a result of the prolongation of many of the conflicts is that the resources themselves become the very object of struggle. And that's when conflicts morph, if you will, into a subsequent dimension, a greed phase, if you will, and it becomes much, much more difficult to come to conflict resolution.
Indeed it does. And on that point of conflict resolution and the peace process, this is a big part of your own scholarship. What is the implication of what you've just said for how peace is sought? I mean, the integration of the factors that go into war obviously affect how peace is itself sought. Now, does that mean, for example, that those who would bring peace to these regions have to be more holistic, that is to bring more factors into the very search for the resolution of the conflicts now?
Well, it means, I think, two things, George. One is that conflicts need to be addressed at an earlier phase before they enter into this greed phase. When there are genuine grievances, when there is ethnic discrimination, when there are questions of inequality measured against rising expectations, when those kinds of factors are amenable to political and social policies that can be carried out by governments or by governments in the international community. Another aspect, though, has to do with dealing with the ways that wars become profitable for those who are engaged in them. And cutting off the access to resource income has to be a fundamental element of conflict resolution strategy. It's obviously easier in the case of certain commodities than of others. In the case of illegal commodities such as coca or cocaine or heroin, it's very, very difficult. There have been attempts to regulate the international trade in diamonds, to regulate oil markets. These are obviously licit, legal commodities that are much more amenable to control.
Your point, Cindy, about the importance of early intervention to keep things from disintegrating in the first point is admirably made by one of the essays. I think it's Bill Zartman's essay at the conclusion of the book, where he, I think, very specifically mentions the need for those concerned about peace to keep weak states from becoming failed states, that this is perhaps one of the most important things, that the real danger is in the weakening of states that leads to these unending conflicts.
Exactly. I think that behind a lot of conflicts are very key failures of governance, both political governance and economic governance. What governments traditionally do, what states provide, are some minimal amount of security, but also political goods as well as economic goods. And when the state becomes incapable of supplying populations with those basic needs, I think there's a great deal of potential for conflict. So enhancing state capacity, enhancing the legitimate functions of governance, I think is a critical aspect of conflict prevention.
Indeed it is. Cindy, with your help, I'd like to look at a couple of case studies, if you will, drawn from the book. And there are many in this book. I mean, there's an array of countries treated: Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I'd like to take a focus, if you will, on a couple of them, Colombia and Lebanon. Colombia, a country which you devoted a lot of scholarly attention to yourself. And one of the first things I think I'd bring to the attention of our viewers is that in terms of long-running conflicts, internal warfare in Colombia has lasted 57 years. It was the longest-running conflict of the 20th century, I'm given to understand, and persists to this day. That in itself is stunning. And Mark Chernick, I think, provides the essay that you have in this book. But one of the questions I want to ask you about that very longevity, if you will, of war, is it the same war? Or have these been successive conflicts that have mutated over time? Or what has gone on over 5 decades of warfare in Colombia?
I think that's a key to understanding the central lesson of the cases that we've looked at, is that the longer wars go on and the longer they mutate into a greed phase, the more difficult they become to resolve. The Colombian conflict was initially about ideology. I still believe that it is about fundamental inequalities, particularly in rural areas, but there has been such an overlay foray of the cocaine economy onto the war by both guerrilla actors and also by paramilitary forces that rose up to fight them, that the income from the drug trade is now a critical element explaining why people fight and why they're able to continue to carry out such high levels of violence.
If we go back to the origins of things, Cindy, in the case of Colombia, when grievances were primary, so to speak, the first phase, perhaps, is that the era known as La Violencia, I guess the decade just after the Second World War where the violence seemed to have broken out in Colombia? I'm trying to get a sense of when it was an ideological matter more than anything else.
Right. It, I think, was born, the FARC, the largest insurgent group, was born ideologically in the 1960s, inspired, as many guerrilla movements were at the time, by the model of the Cuban Revolution, by Marxist ideology, and it came about as explicitly a movement to try to take state power and organize the state along Marxist principles. And I think that there is probably some element of Marxist ideology that continues to inform the FARC leadership, but particularly in the 1990s, with successes of coca eradication in Peru, there was really an explicit decision by drug traffickers in Colombia, who were responsible for most of the commercialization aspects of the narcotics trade, to move coca production into southern Colombia so that there would be greater proximity between where the coca leaf was grown and where it was processed and from which it was exported. And that provided enormous opportunities.
Right. Of course, that interdiction of cocaine production in Bolivia and other countries was largely an American effort, wasn't it? And which ironically led to the refocusing of that trade in Colombia, as you pointed out.
Exactly. Well, there's been, I think, for a long time, reference to a so-called balloon effect, that as long as the demand for illegal narcotics remains as high as it does, and the profits in the trade are as astronomical as they are, there will be an incentive to produce drugs. And so if you suppress them in one area, they move to another. Right. And the real question, I think, is whether the heavy investment that the United States government has made and the Colombian government has made in drug eradication in southern Colombia is really sustainable, and whether there will be displacement into other areas of Latin America and possibly even other areas of the world.
Have the actors in the Colombian wars remained the same over time, Cynthia? I mean, I'm thinking, Cindy, of the the first phase where it really is a question of ideology, up to the point where we have, as a sense, drug kingpins, if you will, operating under the uniforms of the militia. Are new actors introduced into this, or are these the same elements that we've been seeing historically?
Well, I think that there is a gradual blending of certain kinds of actors. In response to the outbreak of guerrilla war, a number of so-called self-defense organizations, paramilitary groups, were formed that explicitly attempted to substitute for the lack of a state presence and the lack of security that should have been provided by the government. And those paramilitary groups were deeply involved in narco-trafficking, and many people believe are now trading in their weapons and demobilizing as part of a peace process with the government in order to transform themselves into actors in the illegal economy in a much more sustained way.
Because of that transformation and because of this historical process, Cindy, how should we look at this conflict now? I mean, is this the case where greed has effectively trumped creed, where now it's all about drugs, so to speak, or are the factors intermixed in a new way? I mean, what is the relationship between the three forces, if you will?
Right. I'm not sure that greed totally trumps the need and identity issues, although there are certainly claims, particularly by the U.S. government and the Colombian government, that has become the case. I think that there still are underlying grievances, particularly in rural areas, unequal development, great disparities between rural areas and urban areas in Colombia, even though the country is largely an urbanized population, and many, many areas in which inequalities, and particularly inequalities in the distribution of land, form aspects of a grievance agenda that could be addressed. That being said, the drug trade will have to be fought as in certain ways as it is now, and in other ways by much more concerted efforts at prevention and reduction strategies in the developed countries, and even in other Latin American countries. Brazil is now a major consumer of Colombian cocaine, as well as more intelligent alternative development strategies that give Colombian peasants that have migrated to different and ever more remote areas of the country over a series of decades, give them sustainable income in other kinds of activities.
So these two things must be linked, a more sophisticated attack, if you will, on the drug trade itself, coupled with an equally much more sophisticated developmental effort on behalf of the aggrieved peasants who've always been at the core of
exactly, but I think that there's there's the issue of co-responsibility by the countries that consume drugs, for which Colombia is the primary world supplier now of cocaine. And I think that the amount of money spent in the United States on domestic demand reduction has certainly gone up since the early 1990s, but perhaps we could develop a better mix between prevention and treatment and the strictly law enforcement aspects of demand reduction.
Well said. You know, another country, and treated in this book, another area of the world where drugs certainly have influenced what's gone on is Lebanon. But before even introducing drugs into the Lebanon discussion we're just about to have, the first thing that struck me as I read the chapter in this book on Lebanon, it's a riveting piece, by the way, is that of all the countries in the world, Cindy, that I could think of where creed, that is to say, is important, where communities, confessional communities have interrelated over decades, if not centuries, Lebanon is the example. So therefore, let me start our conversation on Lebanon with this question. Was the breakdown in communal violence really the start of the Lebanon civil war in 1975, or was it a more complex interworking of that and greed over the spoils of what had been a very prosperous couple of decades prior to that, and the introduction of drugs at the same, all of these things mixing up at the same time?
Well, at the risk of oversimplification, I mean, I think that the Lebanese conflict can and probably should be largely understood as a creed-based conflict, as an identity conflict between Christian communities and Muslim communities. But that being said, there were certain aspects of behavior during the Civil War of cooperation between and among the militias across these ethnic boundaries that seemed inexplicable until one looked at the economic dimension and one looked at the various resources that were available in Lebanon during the war years, both the resources from the drug economy, from illegal oil imports, from the trafficking in land, and also the kinds of remittances sent from the various diaspora communities to the different factions. And those provided resources that became a source of great cooperation among certain militias that were understood to be in deep competition over ethnic and identity lines.
I'm delighted with that answer. I want to concentrate on a couple of the things that you've mentioned, Cindy. First of all, throughout this depiction of the Lebanese war from 75 to 90, I was struck by that you would have militias representing creedal groups, confessional groups, at each other's throats in one instance, but collaborating also because they had kind of mutually reinforcing drug-related interests to carry out. That on the one hand being something that confused the state of play, if you will. And the second, I'd like to get more of your comment on as well, was the influence of this diaspora community and kind of fueling the emphasis on sectarian differences as this process wore out itself.
Exactly. Well, the large amounts of capital flight, but also the remittances from communities that fled Lebanon at the height of the Civil War provided ongoing resources to the various militia factions. And those militias then controlled the access of the diaspora communities to the resources that were still in Lebanon, whether they were in the form of bank deposits or in the form of land. But what is really, I think, useful and interesting to consider in terms of the economics of war literature and how that contributed to our understanding of the Lebanese conflict is that those kinds of behaviors that would have seemed anomalous became very logical once one looked at the economic dimension and not simply the ethnic or identity dimension of the conflict. Another thing that's important to remember about the Lebanese case is that the kinds of corruption and the kinds of economic relationships across ethnic and identity lines persisted into the post-war era and had an extraordinarily distortionary effect on the development of the post-war economy and contributed to very, very high levels of corruption.
That's exactly what I wanted Russ to come to, and that is the legacy, if you will. After the post-1990, Lebanon is probably a far different place because of that war and because of these new interworkings of need, greed, and creed created by it.
Exactly. Well, it's certainly, I think, a good thing that the shooting war in Lebanon has stopped and that the population lives at peace relatively. But one should not underestimate the distortionary effect of the kinds of economic relationships that grew up in wartime in the post-war economy. And I think it's been very frustrating for the international community and for international financial institutions that have attempted to assist in Lebanese post-war reconstruction to confront those embedded networks.
Have those sectarian differences in Lebanon, divisions, better said perhaps, I'm thinking here of the actions of the diaspora community and the way it is sort of related to its kin groups furnishing money and kind of emphasizing the differences, if you will, between them. Has that remained a very powerful factor in the Lebanon of today?
I think it's less of a factor, but I think as in other conflicts, not just Lebanon, diaspora communities sometimes remain more committed to a particular set of identity beliefs than even the people on the ground that are doing the fighting. And the people inside the country become proxies, as you will, for playing out historic grievances and historic feelings of discrimination. I think that's less of a case now, as many people in the diaspora have reinvested in Lebanon or have even physically returned.
Right. Cindy, as you looked at the African cases recounted in this book, Sierra Leone, Angola, Congo, were the patterns similar to what we discussed in terms of Colombia and Lebanon? That is to say, resources, assuming a different character, if you will, as the conflict lengthened.
Certainly. And let's take the case of Angola, for example. What started out as an anti-colonial war against Portuguese domination in the 1970s became one of these quintessential conflicts in which the Cold War had a serious impact. Competition between the United States, the Soviet Union, the actual military involvement of Cuban troops, the involvement of South Africa, a number of external powers played a role in supporting one faction or another in the Angolan Civil War. And over time, resources became extraordinarily important. The control of oil resources for the MPLA, for the government, and the control of diamond wealth for the main insurgency of UNITA, which was led by Jonas Savimbi and covertly supported and then overtly supported by the United States. And it led to a very violent and extremely degraded conflict with an enormous impact on the civilian population over many, many years. But Angola, I think, is also an interesting case in that the presence of this kind of resource income did not prohibit a settlement at one point. In 2002, Jonas Savimbi was killed by Angolan troops, and the insurgency effectively collapsed. And it became possible, to end the war with the elimination of a leader who himself had resisted and violated the previous peace settlements.
But that's very interesting to me. Why were we able to get, or why was the world community able to get a peace settlement in in those circumstances?
Well, again, I think it shows the role of leadership, and one should not separate, these conflicts from questions of human agency and choice, and, if you will, political entrepreneurship. As Bill Zartman points out in his conclusion, you can have many places that are a tinderbox, but it takes a certain person to throw the match. And the role of leadership in places like Angola and places like Peru is absolutely critical in sustaining an insurgency. And just as the Angolan War came to settlement following the death of Savimbi, I think the same was true in Peru in 1992 following the capture of the main leader of the Sendero Luminoso insurgency, Abimael Guzman.
Exactly. Cindy, in the time remaining to us as we come to the conclusion of our conversation, you mentioned early on, and again it was also mentioned in Bill Zartman's essay, that the need for early intervention, so to speak, and not letting things get out of hand from the start. Obviously good advice. But what other things occur to you as a result of having put together a volume like this in terms of the way the world can positively affect the outcomes in these conflicts? I mean, what has to be done? How do they have to be approached? And what are the techniques, if you will, of trying to achieve peace?
Well, I guess it comes down to a question of how the international community is going to manage economic globalization, because the same sort of connectedness and trade liberalization and integration of the world that is seen as the primary manifestation of globalization also has the very perverse effect of allowing international criminal networks to market their commodities and market their goods. And so I think that a key to looking at conflicts, particularly where resource income is present, is getting the involvement of the private sector, of governments, in managing the ways the commodities are commercialized and brought into the global economy, and then that's going to be an essential part of conflict resolution in this century.
Cindy, that's a marvelous answer, and I really appreciate you putting it in the context of globalization, which hadn't, quite frankly, occurred to me. But it seems to me that is precisely what we have to be thoughtful of as we consider these two long-lasting wars. Cynthia Arnson, thank you so much for being with us on
Thank you,
Dialogue
George.
today.
It's a pleasure.
Mine.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. And Cynthia Arnson, thank you.
Thanks, George.